Hello and welcome. My name is Joe Musa and you will be viewing a video presentation on the application of ethical principles. Today I'm going to be speaking of ethical principles which I learned in the professional ethics course I took at Toron University with Professor James Herzen. As an introduction, let's take a look at the three ethical principles that we will be discussing today. The first ethical principle that we will be discussing is Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. The second is Cecilia Bock's ethical decision-making framework. These first two ethical principles I learned throughout the course and the course readings. The last ethical principle we will discuss is the Christian ethic, of which I learned through an outside source. Let's begin our discussion by talking about the first ethical principle we will be discussing, which is Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. Immanuel Kant states that individuals should act as if the choices one makes for oneself could become universal law. Second point that Immanuel Kant states is that you should act so that you treat each individual as an end and never as merely a means. It's very important to understand that these two ideas are considered as universal. They are not subject to situational factors. Let's take a closer look on how we can apply this type of idea into our own personal lives. One of the reasons why I chose this ethical principle to apply and to really discuss is because it harkens to one of my favorite quotes within the Bible, which is, "Therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do to them also." This is the type of idea that Immanuel Kant tried to communicate to all people. Now, let's see how we can actually apply this. Me, myself, I'm an auditor, and as I look at how to apply this in my own life, I must understand that auditors have to treat their clients with the same attitude they would like the client to treat them with. You'll see many times in the relationship with the auditor and the client, it could be a little rough, because the client is giving information to the auditor and the auditor is also always scrutinizing that type of work. As we can see here, the client can be overwhelmed with the auditor's field work because the client is trying to get their own work done on top of answering and meeting the requests and the deadline that the auditors have on them. And of course, we see that disagreements over accounting treatments are always discussed throughout the audit. And we have to understand that we need to get away from something called the blame game. Why is the audit late? Why are things lagging? Most people try to point to the other direction, but it's important for the client and an auditor to work as a team in terms of getting the audit done and being on the same page. How can we apply this? Number one, auditors should be courteous to the client. Number two, auditors should not let disagreements reach the point of arguments. Many times you'll see whenever there are disagreements over the accounting treatment of items, people can really get a little angry when they don't see eye to eye with the auditor's view. So you have to let disagreements be disagreements, end the meeting there, and get some further support in terms of backing up your point. Number three, you should give the client ample time to meet requests. We see this a lot where the auditor kind of gives many specific things they want from the client all at once, but you have to be able to space those things out so that the client can meet a realistic deadline for when specific items need to be turned in by. And of course, the last thing, which is probably the most important, you have to be on the same page with regards to the status of the audit. Many times you'll see that auditors and the client are really not communicating and not on the same page. So there needs to be bi-weekly meetings where you review the status, where everybody understands where they are in terms of the flow of the audit so that you can really get the work done. Let's move on to the second ethical principle that I'd like to speak of, which is Cecilia Bock's ethical decision-making framework. For us to understand this framework, we need to know that there are two very important premises that this framework is based on. First premise is, we must have empathy for the people involved in ethical decisions. The second is, we have to maintain social trust, as this is a fundamental goal. Now, let's take a look at the three important steps to Cecilia Bock's ethical decision-making framework. Let's take a look at Bock's 3 steps to her overall decision-making model. The first step that we must do when we approach very tough ethical decisions is we must consult our own conscience and ask ourselves, how do we feel about the specific action or the specific decision that's at hand? Secondly, we must seek expert advice for alternatives to the act creating the actual ethical problem. And lastly, we must conduct a public discussion with the parties involved in the dispute. Now let's take a look at how we can apply this model to one of the very common things that auditors face whenever they approach or are in a specific audit. Let's take a look at how we can apply this model. Now, throughout my 4 years of experience in the audit field, I learned that there is one extremely touchy subject that many auditors have a hard time dealing with, and that's uncovering actual fraud. Now, you'll notice that many times throughout an audit, we as auditors will find mistakes. We'll find things that went wrong purely based on mistake, not really intentional, but lots of unintentional mistakes. But whenever you find or experience going through actual fraud, there has to be a process that one goes through to really be able to communicate this to the client, to the audit committee, and also to your own managers and partners. So using Bock's model, we can actually figure out a really good and appropriate way of going about this ethical dilemma. Step 1. Consult your conscience. Sometimes when you do an audit for so long with a specific client, you get to know them. You get to be friends with them. You see each other for a long period of time, every single day. You build a very good relationship and a very close friendship. And this may come in the way in case you do find something that's going on behind the scenes that involves somebody that you become close with. But when we really look inside our conscience, we have to understand as auditors that fraud is an extremely serious offense. One of the reasons why it's so serious is because there's so many people out there investing in companies, and they need to know what's going on behind the scenes so that they're comfortable with their investments and they're comfortable knowing that the company they're investing in has very, very good and clean financial statements. Results. We have to understand that an audit is absolutely pointless unless such an offense is reported. Now, the reason why it's so pointless is because the audit should uncover things that go on that a normal person is not able to see just by looking at financial statements. And if the auditor is hiding stuff, then for sure no one will know about it. And we have to understand that within audit, there are tough decisions are always made. And one of these tough decisions comes when you have to communicate fraud. Let's move on to step 2. In step 2, now we have to take a look at the situation of uncovering fraud and consider different alternatives. Not everything that's a mistake is fraud. So it's very important that you analyze the situation and look at different alternatives as opposed of just immediately uncovering it and throwing it at the client or the audit committee, or the other end, immediately hiding it. We have to understand that uncovering fraud is not clear-cut. It's not easy to make that final conclusion that somebody did an actual fraudulent act. So when we take a look at this, one of the results from actually seeking alternatives would be to interview other people. Conducting fraud interviews is a very normal aspect of audit. So if you think or sense that something's going on in the background that can lead to fraud, the greatest thing to do would be to interview other people within the company and ask them important questions that may give you assurance that there is fraud or give you assurance that there is not. Another very important thing is, as a staff, as a senior, you need to immediately communicate these things to your manager or partner and find out from them how you can proceed. Let's move on to the third and final step of Bock's framework. Public discussion. Sometimes it can be very intimidating when you uncover something as important and as critical as fraudulent financial behavior, especially when it involves somebody close to the audit. It's important to understand that although it may be difficult to communicate these items to the client, it's important to do so. First of all, these items must immediately be brought up to the audit committee, which is a group of individuals, a part of the organization, but are away as board members who make decisions on who to pick as auditors and also who are very invested in the audit report. Additionally, such offenses should be included in the audit report itself so that the public knows exactly what the company is doing behind doors. In our third and final ethical principle and methodology, we will learn about the Christian ethic. And this is one of those ethics that have been true to my heart, as I am a Christian and have been trying to follow this type of ethic throughout my whole life. Let's take a look at some of the key verses that we can learn from to apply this type of methodology into our own lives. From Matthew chapter 6 verse 33, we see the verse, "But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things should be added to you." And in general, this verse tells us that in order for us to really be able to apply the Christian ethic in our own lives, we must first go after and run after and seek after God. Everything else that we need, everything else that is needed upon us, God knows about and will provide these things to us as long as we put God first. The Christian ethic tells us a few things. Number one, we need to understand that the ultimate goal in our lives is to enter the kingdom of heaven. Number two, once this goal is established, ethical issues which arise will ultimately be resolved by asking the question, what would Jesus do? It's important to understand that our overall goal in life is to get into heaven. After that, nothing else really seems to be too important. And also, ethical issues can be immediately solved by looking at the main source of life, which is the Word of Christ. Those who use the Christian ethic will turn to the Bible to answers to problems which would arise throughout your life. When approaching ethical decisions using the Christian ethic, there are very important factors that must be considered. First of all, when approaching problems and issues, you must always approach it with love. Jesus Christ taught that love is really the cure of all ailments. And whenever we have issues or problems amongst each other, we must always consider these issues with the background of love and understand that we should all be loving each other as opposed to trying to one-up each other, as we see in many of the examples we learned of the cases throughout the course. Second, we must apply humility and selflessness in all aspects of ethical decision making. As we have seen in many examples and many cases in our course, we've seen corporations who are acting with much pride, who are acting very selfish and want the best decision for them financially. And usually that leaves the end user alone, helpless, not being able to defend themselves and at a loss financially. Next, we must always be thinking about the effects of your decisions and how those effects impact others. Corporations don't really think about how their effects impact others, as their main concern is to make money, is to bring in a profit. And they never really think about the people that they're selling the products to and how those decisions and those ethical dilemmas impact them. Lastly, it's very important to understand that sacrificing for the sake of making the correct decision is one of the bases of the Christian ethic. As Jesus Christ taught us, sacrifice is one of the key elements to being a typical good Christian. And this is why Jesus Christ sacrificed himself for us, in order to teach us that same exact methodology to apply in our own lives. In conclusion, I really learned a lot throughout this course. One of the main things that I learned is that making ethical decisions is definitely not easy, and being able to have a good foundation and a good ethical methodology to approaching these types of decisions is extremely important. Not everything is really clear whenever making these types of decisions, and I've learned through the cases that applying different types of methodologies is very important. Overall, I believe that I've learned a great deal and have a very good foundation on being able to make ethical decisions in the future. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.